Hello and welcome to the Planet Outlook lecture series. Our guest today is an award-winning author and environmentalist, Tristram Stuart, based in UK. He is well known across the planet for his expertise on the environmental and social impact of food waste. He is World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and a National Geographic Emerging Explorer. Over to you, Tristan.
Thank you very much, Ananda. As you know, Ananda, my career started with you as my colleague too many years ago to count in Delhi with the Centre for Science and Environment. And at that time, I was a young Western ideological environmentalist. And when I was working in India, I learned to look at the environment in a very different way, and in particular to look at nature as a habitat for humans as well as for wildlife and nature. And my entire career has been built on the insights that I very much feel were enriched during that experience. And for me, land has always been the central question for humanity's treatment of the environment. And in particular, how humans are currently using land to grow food. Many people don't realize that the single biggest environmental impact that humans have on the planet, it's not aeroplanes, it's not factories, it's not cities, it's not roads, it's not transport. It's food production, it's farming. The way in which humans produce their food is, of course, to remove almost all other biodiversity, all the forests, all the other plants and animals and insects and birds and fungi, and instead create fields that are full of crops for human consumption or the consumption of our livestock. This has a colossal impact on biodiversity, on water. Of course, it is also the single biggest release of carbon dioxide emissions. It's by far the biggest user of fresh water. It's the main reason in the world right now why species are going extinct. Deforestation in South America, in Southeast Asia, particularly in Central Africa, and even also in India. And this isn't to say we shouldn't have farming, we shouldn't have fields, but it is to say that because food production is such a huge environmental impact, we must use every bowl of food to its maximum potential. And we're so very far from adopting that as a general principle within the world's food system that there is an enormous gap between what we need to be doing and what we currently are doing. And add to that, of course, the hundreds of millions of people around the world who simply don't have enough food to eat. The idea that we waste 1/3 of the world's food supply from plow to plate, at least, it's two things. It's both a horrific tragedy, a disgusting aberration of good companionship between humans, but it's also a huge opportunity. If what we want to do is increase food availability where it's needed and decrease environmental impact, cutting down on the colossal scandal of food waste is a very easy place to start. And indeed, in Project Drawdown, the famous work of Paul Hawken, he puts food waste in the top 3 environmental areas where we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions most efficiently. And all things, attacking flying, dealing with population, dealing with meat consumption, food waste is one of the top 3 things that we can do. So not only is it a relatively easy place to start, it's also potentially quite a delicious place to start, because eating and enjoying food together rather than throwing it away is, it's a relatively enjoyable environmental initiative. But for me, tackling food waste has always been multidimensional. Of course, we do want to reduce food waste in and of itself, to reduce that environmental impact, to increase food availability where it's needed, but it does another thing as well. The fact that 1/3 of the world's food supply at least is being wasted is the single clearest piece of evidence that the dominant paradigm in the food system today is built on a hypocrisy. The dominant paradigm that I refer to is what I call the productionist paradigm. The idea that we have a looming food crisis, the 9 or 10 billion people expected on the planet by 2050, and that the solution to that crisis is to massively increase global food production. People estimate that we need to increase food production globally by 50, 60, 70, some even say by 100% by 2050 in order to stave off famine and disaster in the world. We have big companies like Monsanto, and I quote, "To feed everyone, we'll need to double the amount of food we currently produce." That's what Monsanto said in 2015. Cargill, another one of the world's biggest food corporations, released statements saying we need a boost in global food production to meet the world's growing demand. And even venerable institutions like the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations have said that global food production must, I repeat, it must double. It must double by 2050 to head off mass hunger. Now, there are multiple problems with this paradigm. The first is that we already know that the food production system in the world is placing an absolutely unsustainable burden on the Earth's life support system. We know that if we transferred tomorrow to green energy for transport, power, and everything, so that there was no fossil fuel consumption for power generation or transportation at all, that happened tomorrow. We know that the food system by itself would take us above the carbon dioxide emissions that we all agreed to avoid in Paris. The food system by itself would cook planet Earth. And the idea that the solution to the world's food problems is to double that already colossal problem is clearly the biggest single threat to long-term food security, because if we destroy the life support system of planet Earth, there will be no food production system. It will suffer cataclysmic effects across the world. There will be crop failures in one part, there will be fires, drought, torrential rainstorm. These are the kinds of effects that all scientists are telling us will happen if we unleash this monster and continue to deforest the earth to grow more food. Now, of course, technology has always played a massive part in increasing food production without increasing that environmental burden. We saw enormous yield increases in the second half of the 20th century. Of course, the Green Revolution in India is really the pinnacle of that mixed success story. But those yield increases have fallen away and are now at less than 1% a year, very often only a fraction of a percent. And even though genetic engineering is touted by many as the new green revolution, there is no genetic engineering that has yielded the kinds of yield increases that we saw with Norman Borlaug's hybrid wheats and the other green revolution crops. The genetic engineering crops that we're familiar with have been engineered to be, for example, resistant to herbicide sprays, or to produce tomatoes that last longer on the shelf, or indeed to produce vitamin supplements like the vitamin A golden rice. These are not significant yield increases. And so even though there are lots of technologies out there, glasshouse production, that have the potential to increase food production without increasing environmental impact, that is not how food production increases are currently being achieved, principally in the world today. The way in which the increase in food production is being achieved globally is by chopping down more forests. The traditional way, increase the acreage of land under cultivation. And in a world where we already don't have enough forests, we don't have enough habitat, we don't have that natural system that produces rain, that cleans our air, that creates the weather system of Earth, the idea of chopping down more forest to grow more food to double global food production, there is no doubt that that strategy would be a complete catastrophe. The second problem with this dominant paradigm within the food system, this idea that we need to double food production by 2050, is that it's wrong. And the reason why I know it's wrong is because I have studied the food availability in every country in the world. And if you just take the rich countries of Western Europe and North America, every single one of those countries has available to its population in its shops and restaurants up to twice the amount of calories that is actually required by the human population of those countries. There is, in other words, an unprecedentedly huge surplus of food available in rich countries. And that food surplus, which falls between 150 and 200% of nutritional requirements, calorifically speaking, is even less than, it hides an even greater surplus, and that is the surplus that is hidden by the inefficient food production system in animal agriculture, where grains are being grown specifically to feed animals to produce meat and dairy products. If you include those calories that are embedded within the food system and are essentially wasted because animals convert feed to food very inefficiently on a ratio globally of 3 to 1, that's an average global system feed conversion ratio rather than any specifically farming system. So 3 calories of grain or other foodstuffs go into the animal agricultural system globally, only 1 comes out as meat and dairy. So if you include that hidden, embedded food, then rich countries have between 2 and 4 times the amount of calories they actually need to feed their population. And that food surplus lies at the root of another massive problem, and that is the problem of overconsumption. Indeed, the biggest health crisis on Earth today, the one that affects most people, is the problem, ironically, of overconsumption. 2 billion people on Earth eat more than is good for their own health. And the consequences of that we see are obesity, diabetes, and numerous other disorders that arise from simply eating too much, and in particular, eating too much of the environmentally damaging products, meat and dairy products. And so what we can see is that, in fact, the problem of overconsumption and overproduction, which creates, on the one hand, an environmental catastrophe, on the other, a public health catastrophe, are best solved by tackling the other side, which is, well, let's produce less in those over-consuming countries, or consume less and distribute food more fairly. What we should be focusing our attention on is reducing overconsumption and reducing food waste. And that way, we can reduce the environmental impact as well as the burden on the global food supply. And this is not just an environmental imperative, and it's not just a public health imperative in those rich countries. It also speaks to the other half of this problem, the problem of malnourishment in those parts of the world where there isn't enough food. Now, it used to be a bit naive to say there's a connection between greed and overconsumption and waste in the UK and hunger in a country, for example, like India or in Pakistan, your next door neighbors. Well, that unfortunately is no longer naive. There is a real connection between the overconsumption in rich countries and malnourishment on the other. And the reason for that is that we live on an island, and the island is called Earth. And we live in a global food supply chain where the grain stores and the grain trade that people in Africa and South Asia depend on to buy and sell their grains is the very same one that we use in the United Kingdom and the United States. This was really vividly brought home to me in 2008, which you'll probably, anyone old enough to remember, will remember that was the year of the enormous food price spike. The price of rice and wheat and all other grains skyrocketed in that year. And the reason for that was that global demand outstripped supply. And the result of that, of course, was price increases. And those price increases were not isolated to any particular country. That was a global phenomenon. And at the same year, I was in Pakistan. I saw, well, frankly, daughters who were not being fed enough food to eat in the slums around Islamabad and Karachi. And those were families that had previously been able to afford enough to eat, but now with the food price spikes were no longer able to feed every member of their family. And it was young girls very often who were going without the needed calories. In that same year, I visited factories here in Britain where I saw tons and tons of bread being wasted just because they were the end slices of a loaf of bread, and we don't make sandwiches for the supermarkets with those end slices. I went to a factory where there were 13,000 slices of day fresh bread being thrown away every single day, and I knew that was just one factory of many, many hundreds of factories doing exactly the same thing. And that made me see this wheat that made the bread came from the very same global marketplace that people in Africa, India, Pakistan, you name it, they were buying wheat from the same place, buying and selling wheat on that same world market. And therefore tackling waste in the rich world alleviates the problem of a deficit of food in the developing world. On top of that, of course, it's very often developing world countries that will bear the worst burdens of the environmental catastrophe that we are in the middle of. You only need to look to your other neighbor, Bangladesh, of course, to know that low-level land is very susceptible to flooding. And if we have sea level rises as a result of global warming contributed to very largely by the food system, we will be creating a humanitarian disaster on a scale that we have never seen if we persist in this paradigm of the need to double food production by 2050. I want to make a very significant note here, and that is to say, the argument I'm making does not mean that we shouldn't be increasing food production in some specific parts of the world. Indeed, if you look at your strategy for how to tackle this problem, increasing productivity in some parts of the world, let's take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, by a better use of technology, by a better use of farm inputs, by better and more accurate ways of growing and harvesting food, you can alleviate hunger as well as improving on-farm income and building that ladder out of poverty for some of the people that need it most. Increasing food productivity in specific areas and specific markets is a huge opportunity, and we should certainly be investing in that. That's very different from saying what we need is a global doubling of food production. So, if, as I've argued, the case against the productionist paradigm is so clear, why is it that Monsanto, Cargill, and other huge corporations are pushing this agenda so hard that even venerable institutions like the UN are parroting their cry? Well, the unfortunate truth is that whilst within those organizations there are certainly well-meaning, dedicated, and brilliant individuals who care about nothing more than nourishing the earth and looking after the planet. The problem is that those organizations, the big corporations, are built with a legal obligation to maximize financial returns for their shareholders and their owners. And that is the duty of a corporation. Where the law allows them to deforest the earth or profit from the deforestation of the earth in order to increase their revenues and increase their profits, they actually are obliged to pursue that agenda, if they hold back from anything that could yield them profit, they can be sued by their shareholders. The argument that these companies need a sustainable food system in order to survive in the long term is not, in my view, a sufficiently robust way of ensuring that they do not form part of what is ultimately an irreparable and devastating attack on the natural world to grow more food, to produce more profit, to produce products like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. That the idea that we need more of that stuff in the world when it's not even healthy to drink and represents an obvious unnecessary consumption of land and water and contributes to the public health crisis I mentioned earlier. The idea that we need to double that problem is clearly erroneous. And so we have a profit-driven food system that does not have any legal obligation to look after planet Earth, let alone the welfare of all the humans on the Earth. And therein lies the crux of the problem. So to revert to that problem of food waste that I started with, food waste is a big problem that we can solve by wasting less and reducing environmental impact as a result. But it also points to that hypocrisy. If it's true that what we need is to double food production, why is it that with the other hand, we're throwing away more than a third of the food that we're growing? This doesn't make any sense at all. The causes of food waste in a very specific way. I will start with one of the more surprising areas of food waste, and that is the food that is wasted on farms in developing world countries like India and South America and Africa. Many farms that I have visited that are producing fruit and vegetables in these parts of the world are wasting sometimes up to half or even more of their crops. This is not because the farmers are profligate, negligent, or don't care about their food. Quite the opposite. This food is their livelihood, and for reasons that are not too difficult to understand, they nevertheless have to waste a lot of their food. The first problem is that in developing world countries, farmers often lack the financial resources to invest in the kind of infrastructure that is required to get the food from the field to the market before it spoils. I remember watching, I think it was aubergine, eggplant, being harvested in India. They were all being thrown into sacks, chucked on the back of a motorbike, driven along a bumpy road in the full heat of the sun. And of course, on the way there, a lot of these products will be bruised and damaged. There's no crates to hold them from stopping from being bruised. The roads aren't in the best of conditions. And then they get to market and they sit in the sun all day and food begins to perish. We've all seen those piles of mangoes covered in flies quickly getting so soft that no customer will buy them. And a lot of food is wasted in that way, unfortunately. Increasing on-farm infrastructure, even things like grain stores to hold grain in a way that prevents it from getting moldy or infested by weevil. That's something that many farmers simply cannot afford, and investing in those kinds of solutions is a very straightforward way. And thankfully, since I wrote my book in 2010, I've seen literally billions of dollars flowing in the direction of investing in on-farm infrastructure to reduce what are called post-harvest losses. The more egregious cause of post-harvest losses in developing world farming is where those crops are being produced for urban populations, particularly in the Western world, but now universally. And there you see the cosmetic standards being applied. So farmers who are producing oranges, for example, in South America. I have a picture here of 1,000 tons of citrus being thrown away in Peru, another country with hundreds of thousands of malnourished people in it. And these citrus fruits are not being wasted because they're bad. They're not being wasted because no one wants to eat them. They're being wasted because they have very minor cosmetic so-called defects, skin blemishes that you can hardly see and that have no impact on the longevity or the taste or deliciousness or nutritional quality of the fruit on the inside. It is purely a skin defect. But the supermarket that these oranges were being grown for had a zero tolerance on skin blemishes, and also were very specific about the size that each piece of fruit had to be, with the result that farmers were being forced to throw them away. I've seen the same thing the world over. I've got mountains of bananas here being wasted in Ecuador because they're the wrong shape or size for the supermarkets. I've seen the same in Colombia, and pretty much everywhere you go in the world where food is being grown for Western supermarkets. Farmers will be wasting food because the orders are being cancelled by the supermarkets at the last minute, or because of minor cosmetic defects. And I've probably never felt more ashamed of being British than when I visited farms in Kenya, and I met women like the ones in these pictures, where entire crops of basil, in this case, were being pulled up and thrown away because the order was cancelled, or sugar snap peas and mange tout being thrown away because the order was cancelled. And probably the most egregious of all was when I discovered that the supermarkets in Britain were getting farmers in Kenya to trim the beans. These are the green beans that people in Western Europe love to eat. We now eat them all year round rather than just when they're in season in our own country. And in order to fit the beans inside the plastic packaging that the supermarkets were selling in it, the farmers were cutting off, and the pack houses were cutting off 20% of the beans just to get them short enough to fit into these stupid 9-centimeter wide packets. The beans didn't know they had to grow 9 centimeters. So even the beans that had won the beauty contest of looking perfectly straight, perfectly slender, totally green, no twists, no turns, just absolute pageant beauty winners, even those 20% were being trimmed off and chucked away. And of course, the Kenyans don't eat these beans themselves, so it was going for cattle feed or simply being left to rot. A huge waste of resources. Indeed, when we campaigned on this issue back in Britain, and we convinced first Tesco, our biggest supermarket, to change the policy and instead start stocking beans that hadn't been trimmed at all, we found that the savings of the farmer amounted to tens of thousands of euros of one single farmer, and that if you extrapolated the savings of wasted bean purely from going from trimming to not trimming your beans, it amounted to 0.04% of the entire Kenyan economy could be earned by no longer throwing away the 20% of that one crop, green beans, being supplied to Europe. A colossal waste of food and money, and of course land and resources. And so there you have some areas where food waste is occurring on farms. You'd think in countries where millions of hungry people would, literally fight to get hold of more food.
Tristram, any examples that you have seen in India, the waste that you're talking about supplying to the Western supermarkets? Anywhere in India you've seen this happening?
We're sitting here in the middle of mango season, Ananda, and I give my wife some boxes of Indian mangoes every year for her birthday. Her birthday, fortunately, falls within mango season, and the Alfonso is, of course, our favorite mango. And I have seen, unfortunately, mangoes being wasted for both the reasons that I've just mentioned, the cosmetic standards being applied for export, but also, of course, that problem of how to get mangoes to harvest, to market without seeing them getting bruised. And we've all seen those piles of mangoes in open markets being exposed to the sun and people unable to sell them before they go bad. So yeah, I mean, you know, I've seen, of course, that going on in India, in Pakistan, all those parts of the world. I went to the wholesale market in Chennai, which I think is the biggest fresh produce market in the world. And there, of course, the buffaloes are going around eating from the heaps of vegetables that are going to waste there, and they'd invested in an anaerobic digestion plant to use up some of that green material to turn it into energy. But yes, in open markets like that, there's a huge amount of waste, unfortunately. And then, of course, now you can go down the road and go to some of the hotels that are doing breakfast buffets, eat as much as you want, and the rise of the middle class and the indulgence in that food culture of eat as much as you want, which people associate with the kind of wealth and extravagance of the West. I saw food waste both on farm, in those wholesale markets, and of course then with the growing middle classes in India, which is of course something to celebrate. But the waste that I saw at those buffets was definitely not something to celebrate, both on people's plates, but also at the end of the buffet, where all of the dishes had been served in huge quantities right to the very end. The waste was truly shocking. And I'm sure anyone who's listening, who's been to some of these outfits will have witnessed the same. The problem got so bad at weddings in India that you even passed a law, one of the most progressive food waste laws in the world. Whether it's enforced or not, I don't know, but it imposed a maximum number of dishes to be served at weddings, and that was designed to reduce the spectacular food waste that was happening at many weddings. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this yourself, Ananda.
Thank you, Tristram, so much.